The voice of a mother. The story begins not with power, not with wealth, and not with the giant glass buildings of Silicon Valley, but with a small house in Chennai, where the walls were painted with modest colors and the air carried the sound of ordinary life. It was in this place, filled with the warmth of family and the aroma of fresh South Indian meals, that a boy named Sundar grew up. The streets outside were alive with bicycles, vendors calling out prices for fruit, and children running barefoot, their laughter echoing like music in the background. Nothing about those streets suggested that one day, someone from among them would stand before the most powerful leaders in the world. Yet life has a way of shaping the unexpected. From the very beginning, Sundar's life was marked not by privilege, but by humility. His father worked in a factory dealing with machines and numbers, while his mother, Lakshmi, cared for the home and spoke to him with words that carried more weight than she could have imagined. She would tell him in Tamil, "Do not forget, Sundar, kindness is not weakness, humility is not smallness, it is strength in disguise." And though he was just a boy, Sundar listened. Those words sank deep into him like seeds planted in soil, waiting for the day they would bloom. Years later, when people would see him standing on a global stage, they would admire his intelligence, his calm nature, and his ability to stay grounded despite the storm of attention. But few knew that behind those qualities stood a mother's quiet voice, spoken in Tamil, shaping him piece by piece. The hook of this story lies in a moment that came much later, when Sundar, by then the CEO of Google, returned to India and found himself sitting beside Prime Minister Modi. It was supposed to be a formal meeting filled with protocol, cameras, and official words. But what happened that day was something no one had prepared for. Sundar's mother, Lakshmi, spoke to Modi ji in Tamil, her native tongue. Her voice trembled slightly, not out of fear, but because of the weight of the moment. The cameras caught her, and millions would later watch the video. People expected Modi ji to smile politely or perhaps let a translator step in. But instead Modi ji replied, not in English, not in some rehearsed line, but in Hindi. It was a simple reply, yet it carried a warmth, a respect that touched millions across India. For a brief moment, the barriers of language, class, and power melted away. But before we reach that powerful scene, we must go back. Because the story of how Sundar got there is one of struggle, resilience, and the quiet strength that often goes unnoticed until it is tested. As a child, Sundar was curious. He had a habit of asking too many questions, sometimes about things his father could answer, sometimes about things no one in the room knew. When the family got their first rotary phone, Sundar stood beside it, turning the dial again and again, fascinated by how each click and spin led to a different number. While most children would get bored quickly, he wanted to understand how the dial tone traveled, how voices could leap across wires and reach someone far away. His father noticed this spark and told him, "Learn as much as you can, Sundar. Education is your bridge to the world." But education was not always easy. The family lived modestly and resources were limited. Sundar studied under dim lights, often using borrowed books and sometimes skipping small comforts to save money for school needs. Yet he never complained. Instead, he carried his mother's words within him, reminding himself that true strength was in patience and humility. When Sundar reached the stage of applying for college, doubts crept in. There were whispers in the neighborhood. Is it even possible for someone like him to get into such places? He's smart, yes, but these institutions are for the privileged. Sundar heard these voices, and they stung, but he kept going. When he was accepted into the Indian Institute of Technology in Kharagpur, it felt like a door opening to another universe. It was not just a school, it was a battlefield of ideas, filled with some of the brightest minds in the country. Sundar, quiet and observant, often felt like an outsider at first. Others came from wealthier families with better preparation, sharper English, and more confidence. Sundar spoke less, but when he did, people noticed. His thoughts were clear, his questions thoughtful, and his ideas, though softly spoken, carried depth. Slowly he began to find his place. Yet even here he carried with him the lessons of humility. He did not push himself forward arrogantly, Instead, he built relationships quietly, showing respect, listening carefully, and never forgetting his roots. When he shared food with his friends, he would tell stories of his mother's cooking, laughing at how no matter what success he achieved, nothing could replace the taste of her homemade dosa. And then came the moment when he was offered the chance to study abroad. A scholarship to Stanford in the United States was not just an opportunity, it was a leap into the unknown. The cost of the ticket itself was overwhelming for the family. His father considered taking out a loan, even selling some of their belongings, but Sundar hesitated. He told his parents, "If it is too much, I can stay. I don't want us to be burdened." But Lakshmi looked at her son and said in Tamil, "We will find a way. You are meant to cross oceans." Those words became prophecy. Sundar boarded the plane, carrying with him not just clothes and books but the weight of his family's sacrifice and the hope of something larger than himself. Life in America was not easy. Everything was different. The accents, the food, the culture. Sundar often felt out of place, a stranger trying to navigate a new world. He lived simply, stretching every dollar, sometimes eating the same inexpensive meals for weeks. Yet he never let the struggle break him. Instead, he let it teach him. He watched people carefully. He listened and he adapted. His professors noticed his quiet brilliance. Classmates, at first unaware of the depth within him, began to realize that the soft-spoken student from India was not just another face in the crowd. His ideas about technology, about how people could connect, about how tools could shape lives, were ahead of their time. But success did not arrive in one smooth line. Sundar faced rejection, moments of doubt, and even times when he thought of returning to India. He would sit alone at night, writing letters home, pouring out his worries. But his mother's replies always came with the same strength. "You are stronger than the storms you face. Remember, humility and kindness will carry you further than pride ever will." These words became his anchor. Years later, when Sundar joined Google, he was still the same humble boy from Chennai at heart. While others competed fiercely, he built quietly, creating tools like the Google Toolbar and later leading the development of Chrome. Many did not believe Chrome would succeed. Why create a new browser when Internet Explorer and Firefox already dominated? But Sundar believed. He had seen how ordinary people, like his own family back in India, struggled with slow, unreliable tools. He wanted to make something faster, simpler, something that respected the user. Chrome became a success beyond imagination, and with it, Sundar's journey accelerated. Yet he never lost the calmness, the humility, the grounding voice of his mother in Tamil that reminded him, "You are not greater than anyone else, Sundar. You are not smaller than anyone else either. Walk with balance." And so when the day came that he returned to India as the CEO of Google, he carried with him not just the pride of achievement, but also the humility of his roots. The meeting with Prime Minister Modi was meant to be a celebration of technology and India's growing digital future. But what no one expected was the moment that would soon capture the hearts of millions. Lakshmi Pichai, sitting beside her son, spoke in Tamil. The words were simple, maternal, filled with warmth. The cameras turned toward her, and for a brief second, the world saw not just a global CEO but a son sitting beside his mother. Modi ji leaned forward, listening, and then replied in Hindi. It was not the language that moved people, but the respect behind it. He could have let it pass, but he chose to honor the moment, to honor the mother who had raised a son with such values. The audience, both in the room and later across millions of screens, felt a collective stirring in their hearts. But what did Sundar feel in that moment? Behind his calm smile, there was a rush of memories, of the streets of Chennai, of his mother's voice in Tamil guiding him through doubt, of long nights in America when he held on to her words, of the sacrifices his parents made so he could fly. In that moment, he was not a CEO. He was a son, humbled, grateful, and quietly overwhelmed. And just as the audience leaned in, ready to hear more, something unexpected happened. The cameras caught Sundar lowering his gaze, as if holding back something unsaid. The room seemed to sense it, the silence stretching for a breath too long as though a secret was about to spill. And that is where we leave this part of the story. At the edge of revelation, with millions watching, wondering what Sundar would say next and whether the quiet son from Chennai would finally share the truth of his journey in words the world was waiting to hear. The silence before the storm. The room was still. Cameras clicked, microphones picked up the faint sound of breaths, and the eyes of millions were fixed on Sundar. He sat beside his mother, the Prime Minister on the other side, and yet the weight of the moment felt far larger than the space they occupied. Lakshmi's Tamil words still lingered in the air, and Modi ji's respectful reply in Hindi had touched every heart in the audience. But now, there was silence. A silence that seemed to stretch and stretch, pulling everyone deeper into the story of a son, a mother, and a journey that had spanned oceans and generations. Sundar lowered his gaze, and the smile on his face was gentle but heavy with memories. Behind that smile, a flood of images rushed into his mind. He saw his mother years ago standing at the doorway of their modest home in Chennai, pressing a tiffin box into his hands before he cycled off to school. He saw his father bent over papers late into the night, trying to calculate how to manage expenses, refusing to let his children feel the full weight of financial struggle. He saw himself as a boy, flipping through textbooks under a dim lamp, his curiosity burning brighter than the weak bulb above his head. And then he saw something else, moments of pain, doubt, and the hidden battles he had never spoken about publicly. Battles that shaped the quiet resilience the world admired but rarely understood. Back in Stanford, when Sundar had just arrived in America, he had felt both wonder and loneliness. The campus was grand, the libraries endless, the technology dazzling. But while others seemed to glide effortlessly into this new world, he felt like he was walking against the wind. The English spoken around him was faster, sharper, filled with idioms he had never heard before. Sometimes in class, when a professor asked for input, Sundar would know the answer, but hesitate to speak, fearing his accent might sound strange. And when he did speak, he noticed how some students leaned in kindly while others smirked, amused by his hesitant tone. These moments cut deep. He would return to his small dorm room, close the door, and sit silently, wondering if he truly belonged here. But each time he would unfold a letter from his mother. Her words in Tamil were steady, like the beat of a drum. You are enough, Sundar. The world will try to make you doubt, but do not shrink. Walk forward even if your steps are small. With each letter he found the strength to keep going. He began to see that humility did not mean weakness. It meant staying rooted, even when storms tried to uproot him. Yet the storms did not end. When Sundar graduated, he faced the harsh reality of survival in America. Jobs were competitive, visas uncertain, and the pressure immense. There were nights he sat staring at his bank account, calculating how many days of rent he could afford, how many meals he could skip to stretch his savings. At times, he thought of giving up and returning to India, where at least he would be surrounded by family. But then he remembered the sacrifices his parents had made, the loan his father had taken, the pride in his mother's eyes when she said, "You are meant to cross oceans." So he stayed. Eventually, after a winding path of opportunities and setbacks, Sundar found his way to Google. At first, he was just one among many, another engineer in a sea of talent. No one could have guessed that one day he would lead the entire company. But Sundar had a way of seeing what others overlooked. While many focused on flashy projects, he paid attention to the quiet struggles of users. He remembered his own family back in India, how they accessed the internet on slow connections, how simple tasks became difficult because the tools were not built for them. This memory gave him a mission. When he worked on the Google toolbar, he wasn't just writing code. He was imagining his father sitting at the old desk in Chennai trying to search for information. He wanted it to be simple, fast, respectful of the user's time. And when he later proposed creating a new browser, Chrome, people laughed. They said it was unnecessary, impossible to compete with the giants already in place. But Sundar knew that the ordinary person deserved better. He pushed forward quietly but firmly. And in time, Chrome became one of the most used browsers in the world. All of this, every struggle, every doubt, every small act of resilience, was running through his mind as he sat beside Modi Ji. The Q. Silence in that room was no longer just about language. It was about something deeper, something unspoken, something the world had not yet heard from Sundar himself. And then, as if to break the silence, he remembered a night from years ago. It was during his early days at Google. A project he had poured his heart into was on the verge of being cancelled. Higher-ups were skeptical, and the pressure to abandon it grew. Sundar stayed late at the office, long after others had left, staring at the glowing screen, feeling the weight of defeat pressing on his chest. That night, he called his mother. It was morning in India, and she answered in Tamil, her voice calm, steady. Sundar spoke of his fears, of the possibility that his work might vanish, that his place at Google might weaken. Lakshmi listened quietly, and then she said, "Even if they do not see your worth today, keep walking. The road is longer than you think. Storms come to test, not to end." Those words carried him through, and Chrome was saved. And now, sitting with the Prime Minister with cameras flashing, Sundar felt the same pull. The reminder that humility was not silence, and kindness was not invisibility. The audience leaned forward. Would he speak? Would he share the truth of his journey? The vulnerability behind his calm smile? Sundar opened his mouth slightly, and for a heartbeat, it seemed he might finally let the world see the raw story of his struggles, not just the polished image of success. But just as he was about to speak, an aide stepped forward to whisper something to Modi Ji. The Prime Minister nodded, and the moment broke. The spell of silence shattered, and the conversation shifted to the planned agenda. Digital, India, connectivity, the future of technology. The crowd applauded politely, but in the corners of the room, hearts still held on to the earlier silence, sensing that something deeper had been left unsaid. Sundar, too, felt it. It was as if he had been standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to step into the open only to be pulled back at the last second. He smiled for the cameras. He shook hands. He spoke of innovation and progress, but inside, he carried the weight of the words he had not spoken. That night, alone in his hotel room, Sundar stood by the window overlooking Delhi. The city lights flickered below. Cars moved like veins of fire, and the air carried the hum of restless energy. He thought of the millions of young people in India, dreaming of a future, battling doubts, and wondering if they belonged. He thought of his own journey, the letters from his mother, the sacrifices of his father, the silence in that room when the world leaned in. He felt a stirring within him, a realization that perhaps the time had come not just to lead through technology, but to lead through truth. To share the hidden battles, the rejections, the doubts, the nights of loneliness. To let the world see that success was not a straight line, but a path carved through storms, lit by the small flame of resilience. But how could he begin? How could he step out from behind the polished image and reveal the vulnerability that lived beneath? As he stood lost in thought, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number lit up the screen. It read only one line, but that line made his heart race. "There are stories the world must hear, and they must come from you." Sundar froze, staring at the message, his reflection in the glass of the window staring back at him filled with uncertainty. Who had sent it? And what did it mean? The cliffhanger was no longer just in a meeting room. It was now inside his own life, pulling him toward a truth he could no longer ignore. The message in the night. The room was dark except for the soft glow of the city lights outside the hotel window. Sundar stood frozen, his phone still in his hand, his reflection staring back at him from the glass. The message was short, almost cryptic, and yet it carried a weight that unsettled him. There are stories the world must hear, and they must come from you. Who had sent it? Why now? On the very night when silence had swallowed his voice in front of millions. He sat down on the edge of the bed, the phone still glowing in his palm. The hum of the air conditioner filled the silence, but inside his mind, a louder storm raged. He thought of the silence beside Modiji, the unspoken truth in his chest, the way his mother's words had echoed inside him all day. Perhaps this was coincidence, or perhaps it was something more, an invitation or even a test. He tried to sleep, but his thoughts kept circling. He remembered the faces of young students he had met earlier that day, their eyes bright with ambition, their voices full of questions. They had looked at him with admiration, as though his path had been smooth and certain. Yet the truth was different. His life had not been a straight line of success. It had been a road littered with doubts, wrong turns, rejections, and sacrifices. The world saw the polished image of a CEO, but they did not see the boy who once ate the same cheap meal every day for a week because he could not afford more. They did not see the man who stayed up nights writing code, only to watch his work dismissed by people who never saw his vision. And perhaps that was what the message meant. Perhaps it was time to speak. But how, where, and to whom? The next morning, Sundar went about his schedule as usual. Meetings, presentations, polite smiles. He shook hands, gave speeches, and spoke of the future of digital India. But throughout the day, his mind drifted back to the message. It was like a shadow at the edge of his vision, never fully leaving him. When he returned to his hotel in the evening, he found a second message waiting on his phone. This time it was longer. Your silence inspires respect, but silence also hides. Young people believe success is a clean path. They must know the storms. They must hear how you stood in the rain. Sundar stared at the words, his heart beating faster. This was not random spam. Whoever was sending these messages knew him, or at least knew his struggle. But the number was blocked, impossible to trace. He thought of his mother again. Lakshmi had always told him that words carried power, but only when spoken honestly. As a boy, he had once lied about a grade, hiding a poor score because he feared disappointing her. When she found out, she had not scolded him. Instead, she had said softly, "Truth will always walk with you, Sundar. If you run from it, you will find yourself alone." The words returned now like a gentle knock on his heart. Was he running from the truth of his own journey, presenting only the polished image while hiding the storms that could inspire others? Later that night, as he sat by the window again, he remembered a particular storm. It was his early days at Google. A senior executive had once dismissed his idea for Chrome outright, saying it was a waste of time. Sundar had walked out of the meeting humiliated, his notes crumpled in his hand. For a moment, he considered giving up the idea entirely, but then he remembered his father's sacrifices, the loan for his ticket to America, the quiet dignity of a man who never asked for much, who simply wanted his children to have opportunities he never had. Sundar stayed up all night reworking the proposal, his eyes burning, his hands trembling. He carried it again the next day and again, until slowly the resistance gave way. This memory stung not because of the humiliation, but because the world never saw that side of his story. They saw the success of Chrome, but not the nights of rejection, the weight of doubt. Was it time to reveal those storms? The third message arrived just after midnight. If not you, then who? If not now, then when? The words jolted him. He turned the phone over in his hands as though the weight of the device itself carried meaning. He tried to imagine who was behind it. A student? A friend? Someone inside Google? Or perhaps it didn't matter. Perhaps the point was not who sent the words, but whether he was ready to act on them. The following morning, Sundar visited his childhood neighborhood in Chennai before flying back. He walked down the narrow street where he had once played cricket with friends, where bicycles leaned against walls, where small shops sold sweets in glass jars. People recognized him, their eyes widening with pride. But to him, it was a journey back in time. As he stood outside his old home, memories flooded him. He saw himself as a boy, standing at the doorway with his mother, her hand on his shoulder, as she whispered in Tamil, "Walk humbly, but walk forward." He saw himself cycling to school, books strapped to the back, dreams far too big for the size of his pockets. And then he felt the weight of the present, the reality that millions of young people were standing at their own doorways facing their own doubts. What if his silence kept them from believing they too could walk forward? That night, on the flight back to California, Sundar could not sleep. He opened his laptop and began to write. Not for a speech, not for a press release, but for himself. He wrote about the small house in Chennai, about the sacrifices of his father, about the nights of loneliness in Stanford, about the rejections at Google, about the fear of failure that had followed him like a shadow. His words poured out raw and unpolished, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to write not as a CEO, but as a son, a student, a man who had stumbled and risen again. The more he wrote, the more he felt the silence inside him begin to break. But just as he was about to close the laptop, another message arrived. This time it was different. Not a call to share, not a poetic reminder, but a warning. Be careful. There are some who do not want these stories told. Sundar stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. The words glowed in the dim cabin light, chilling him in a way the earlier messages never had. Was someone watching him? Was this a threat? Or just another push toward truth? The plane hummed steadily through the night sky, but Sundar's mind was restless. He looked around the cabin at the sleeping passengers, each lost in their own world, and wondered if he had unknowingly stepped into a larger story than his own. And as the plane crossed the ocean, carrying him back to California, Sundar realized something. The silence of his life was over. Whether he was ready or not, the world, and perhaps forces he could not yet see, were demanding that he speak. And waiting for him, somewhere beyond the clouds, was the next chapter of a journey that was no longer just about technology or success, but about truth, resilience, and the hidden storms that had shaped him. Shadows of resistance. The plane landed in California just before dawn. The sky was still dark, the city lights below scattered like broken glass across the ground. Sundar gathered his things quietly, but his mind was far from calm. The last message still glowed in his memory like a spark that refused to die. Be careful. There are some who do not want these stories told. As he walked through the airport, he felt a strange heaviness in his steps. The crowds bustled around him, families reuniting, travelers rushing to connections, voices rising and falling. But to him, every sound felt muted, distant. He could not shake the feeling that the words were more than just a warning. They were a reminder that his story, his truth, carried weight far beyond personal memory. When he reached his office later that morning, the familiar rhythm of corporate life greeted him. Emails stacked in his inbox, meetings waiting, reports to review. Yet the ordinary routine now felt like a mask. He carried inside him the tension of two worlds, the polished, efficient CEO expected by everyone at Google, and the quiet, vulnerable man who had begun to write about his storms. His assistant walked in with a schedule update, her voice brisk but kind. Sundar nodded, responding as usual, but she noticed the pause in his eyes. "Long trip?" she asked gently. Sundar smiled faintly. Yes, long trip, and maybe an even longer journey ahead. Later, in a meeting with senior executives, he found himself distracted. They spoke of strategy, markets, competition, the usual language of the corporate battlefield. But as they debated profit margins and product launches, Sundar's thoughts drifted back to the message on the plane. Be careful. Who didn't want these stories told? Was it someone inside the company, worried that honesty about struggle might weaken the brand of invincibility? Or was it something larger, an invisible resistance to vulnerability itself, in a world obsessed with polished success? When the meeting ended, he remained seated for a moment after everyone else had left. The empty room echoed with silence, and he remembered again his mother's voice in Tamil. Truth will always walk with you. If you run from it, you will find yourself alone. That evening, back at home, Sundar sat with his wife on the balcony. The California sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the air warm and quiet. He shared with her the messages, reading them aloud. She listened carefully, her brow furrowed. It sounds like someone is pushing you toward something important, she said softly. But the warning, and that troubles me. Sundar sighed. I've built a life around being careful, measured, calm. I don't chase noise. I don't seek conflict. But maybe that's the problem. Maybe my silence has become too comfortable. She placed her hand over his. Silence protected you, but maybe now the world needs to hear the storms too. Just be sure the storms don't drown you. Her words stayed with him long after the sun had set. In the days that followed, the tension only grew. A group of young engineers at Google invited him to speak at an informal gathering. They wanted to hear his journey, his thoughts beyond the corporate speeches. Sundar hesitated. He knew this could be the moment to share pieces of the truth, but the warning echoed in his mind. Was he ready? The night of the gathering, he walked into the small auditorium where the young employees had gathered. Their faces were eager, their eyes filled with the same hunger he once carried as a student. Sundar spoke of innovation, of resilience, of the importance of building tools for everyone. His words were steady, inspiring, but they were also safe. He did not reveal the storms, the rejections, the loneliness. He ended with polite encouragement, and the room erupted in applause. Yet as he stepped down from the stage, he saw the disappointment hidden in a few faces. They had wanted more. Not just advice, but honesty. Not just the finished painting, but the rough sketches beneath it. That night, another message arrived. You had a chance to speak, but you chose silence again. How long? Will you hide? Sundar felt a sting in his chest. Whoever this was, they were watching him closely. He sat alone in his study, the glow of the lamp casting shadows across the room. He opened his laptop and returned to the words he had begun on the plane. He read them again, the stories of his childhood, of sacrifice, of rejection. And as he read, he realized something. These stories did not weaken him. They humanized him. They connected him to the millions who struggled every day. But if they were so powerful, why was there resistance to telling them? The answer came to him in a conversation the next day. During a board discussion, one of the senior members, a sharp and pragmatic figure, leaned toward him privately afterward. You're getting a lot of attention lately, Sundar. People respect your calm nature, but be careful not to blur that image. Vulnerability is good for personal storytelling, but it doesn't always serve the company. Sometimes it makes people doubt strength. Sundar listened quietly, but inside his heart sank. There it was, the resistance, not from an anonymous stranger, but from the very culture around him, a culture that preferred the mask of perfection to the truth of struggle. That night he called his mother. Lakshmi's voice, though older now, still carried the same warmth. He told her of the messages, the warning, the hesitation, She listened patiently and then said in Tamil, "Fear is not an enemy, Sundar. It is a test. Those who silence truth do so because they fear its power, but truth spoken with humility cannot be stopped." Her words steadied him, but they also deepened the conflict. He now knew that telling his story might not just be a personal choice. It could carry professional risks, even unseen consequences. The fourth message arrived soon after, sharper than before. If you stay silent, you betray those who believe in you. If you speak, you may face storms. Choose. The words cut deep. Sundar closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the choice pressing on him. And then something happened that turned the decision into something far larger. A journalist reached out, requesting an exclusive interview, not about products or technology, but about Sundar's personal journey. They wanted to explore the human side of the CEO. It was the opportunity he had both feared and longed for, but as he considered it, his phone buzzed once more with a new message. This time it was not a nudge, not a warning, but something chilling. If you speak in that interview, be ready. Not everyone will let the truth live. Sundar stared at the screen, the glow of the words reflecting in his eyes. For the first time, he felt not just the weight of truth, but the shadow of danger. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the next step would change everything. Not just for him, but for everyone who looked to him for strength. The weight of truth, the request for the interview stayed with Sundar like an echo he could not silence. During the day, as he moved from one meeting to another, he heard it in the back of his mind. At night, As he tried to sleep, it returned like a whisper in the dark. This was not another product launch, not another keynote about innovation or growth. This was different. This was a chance to reveal the storms he had carried silently for decades. Yet the warning haunted him too. If you speak in that interview, be ready. Not everyone will let the truth live. He tried to dismiss it, telling himself it was just someone trying to intimidate him. But the tone of the message, the timing of it, and the way it pierced directly into his thoughts, it was too precise, too personal. It felt as though someone was watching him, someone who knew the weight of what he was about to do. He sat alone in his office one evening, long after the building had emptied. The city lights stretched out through the glass walls, glowing like 1,000 restless eyes. Sundar opened his notebook, where he had been drafting fragments of his story. He read the words again, the descriptions of his modest home in Chennai, his father's quiet sacrifices, the struggles at Stanford, the rejections at Google. They were honest, unpolished, and deeply human. As he read, he felt both power and fear. Power, because these words carried the truth of his journey. Fear, because he knew that once spoken, they could not be taken back. He remembered the words of his mother once more. Truth will always walk with you. If you run from it, you will find yourself alone. But what if truth made him more alone than silence ever could? The night before he was to give his answer to the journalist, he went home and sat with his family at dinner. The table was simple, the food warm, and for a while they spoke of ordinary things, school projects, weekend plans, the rhythm of family life. But Sundar's mind was elsewhere. After the plates had been cleared, he finally spoke. "They've asked me to do an interview," he said softly. "Not about technology, about me, about my journey." His wife looked at him carefully, sensing the heaviness behind his words. "And you're afraid," she said gently. Sundar nodded. "I've kept so much of it inside. The struggles, the failures, the doubts. I've never spoken of them, not like this. But maybe people need to hear it. Maybe it could help them. But there are warnings too. Messages telling me not to speak, telling me there will be consequences." The room grew quiet. His children listened too, though they were still young. His daughter asked innocently, "Appa, why would anyone not want you to tell the truth?" Sundar smiled faintly, though his heart ached at the simplicity of her question. "Sometimes the truth makes people uncomfortable," he said. "Sometimes it shows things they would rather hide." His wife reached for his hand. "You've always led with humility, Sundar. That's why people trust you. If you share the storms, it won't make them trust you less. It will make them believe they can survive their own." Her words gave him strength, but the warning still clung to him like a shadow. Later that night, he called his mother in India. Lakshmi's voice carried the familiar calmness that had anchored him all his life. He told her of the interview, the opportunity, and the fear. She listened in silence, and then said in Tamil, "My son, when you were a boy, you once fell from your bicycle and scraped your knee. You came home crying and I told you. The scar will remind you not of the fall but of the fact that you stood up again. Your stories are your scars. If you hide them, people will only see the smooth skin and think you never fell. But if you show them, they will see the strength it took to rise." Sundar closed his eyes, her words filling him with a mixture of peace and resolve. The next morning, he called the journalist and said yes. The days leading up to the interview were filled with tension. Some colleagues congratulated him, saying it would inspire millions. Others, more cautious, warned him to stay on message, to avoid revealing too much. One board member even pulled him aside. "Remember, Sundar," he said firmly, "the world admires strength. Too much vulnerability can be seen as weakness. Be careful what you share." Sundar nodded politely, but inside he felt the tug of conflict. Was vulnerability weakness, or was it the truest strength of all? On the evening before the interview, he sat again by the window of his home. The city stretched out in silence, but inside, his heart was loud. He opened his laptop one last time and refined his notes. He wrote about the shame of his first rejection letter, the night he almost gave up on Stanford, the humiliation of being dismissed at Google, but he also wrote about resilience, about the strength he found in humility, about the way kindness had carried him further than arrogance ever could. As he closed the laptop, another message appeared on his phone. This one was different. Longer, more forceful. You think people want storms, but storms create doubt. If you speak, you will not just risk yourself. You will risk the company, the trust, the image. Think carefully. Not everyone will forgive weakness. Sundar stared at the words, his pulse quickening. Whoever this was, they were trying to plant fear deep in him. But as he sat there, he realized something. Fear had followed him all his life. Fear of not belonging at Stanford. Fear of not surviving in America. Fear of failing at Google. Yet each time he had walked through it, he whispered to himself, almost like a prayer, "Storms come to test, not to end." The next day, the interview began. Cameras, lights, microphones, the usual setup. But the atmosphere was different. The journalist leaned in, their questions gentle but piercing. "Sundar," they began, "people admire your calm leadership, your humility. But what they don't know are the struggles behind the success. Will you share those storms with us today?" Sundar took a deep breath. He felt the weight of the warning pressing on him, but he also felt the presence of his mother's voice, his wife's support, his daughter's innocent question. He opened his mouth, ready to speak. But before the words could leave him, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced down, just for a second, and what he saw froze him. Another message. This one was not a warning. It was a threat. If you speak now, the world will not only question you, they will try to break you. His breath caught. The cameras were rolling, the journalist waiting, the world about to hear his truth. And now, in the very moment of decision, he faced the most chilling choice of his life. The courage to speak. The studio lights were hot, casting a glow across Sundar's face. The journalist sat across from him, pen poised, eyes steady, waiting for the story to begin. The cameras were rolling, the microphones alive. The world outside, millions of people across countries and cultures would soon be listening. And yet, in this crowded moment, Sundar felt utterly alone. The phone on the table still buzzed faintly with the message that had arrived seconds before. If you speak, now the world will not only question you, they will try to break you. For a moment, doubt clutched him tightly, colder than the air-conditioned room. He thought of everything at stake, the company he led, the reputation he had built, the expectations of shareholders, employees, leaders. He thought of the millions, of young people who looked to him as proof that humility and intelligence could take you far. Would honesty ruin it all? Would truth tear down what he had built? But then, in the stillness, another memory rose, his mother's voice gentle yet firm, the same words that had followed him all his life. Truth will always walk with you. If you run from it, you will find yourself alone. And suddenly, he understood. Silence had kept him safe. Yes. But it had also kept him apart. It had built walls between his true self and the image the world admired. And now, those walls felt too heavy to carry any longer. He looked up at the journalist. "You ask about the storms," he began softly. And yes, there were many. His voice was calm, but it carried a tremor of honesty that the microphones caught clearly. The journalist leaned in, sensing something different, something raw. "I was not the confident boy people imagine," Sundar continued. "I came from a small home in Chennai. We did not have much. My father worked hard, my mother guided me with her words. I remember studying under a weak light, borrowing books, wondering if I truly belonged in the world I dreamed of," the journalist nodded, encouraging him to go on. Sundar's voice grew steadier. "When I went to Stanford, I felt like an outsider. The accents, the culture, the wealth. It all felt too big for me. I stayed in my small room, eating the cheapest meals, doubting myself constantly. And when I did speak in class, some people laughed at my accent. I carried that humiliation quietly. But what carried me forward were my mother's letters in Tamil, reminding me I was enough. The studio was silent, the crew listening as intently as the audience beyond the cameras. Sundar's words were no longer a CEO's polished message. They were the confessions of a son, a student, a man who had stumbled more times than he had ever admitted. At Google, he continued, I faced rejection too. Ideas dismissed, projects almost canceled. Chrome, which people now use around the world, was once considered unnecessary. I remember walking out of meetings feeling small, humiliated. But I went back again and again, because I knew that ordinary people, like my family in India, deserved something better. Humility taught me persistence. Kindness gave me strength. The journalist's eyes widened. And what kept you from giving up? Sundar paused, his gaze distant as if looking back through the years. I think it was remembering where I came from, remembering my father working late at his desk, counting every rupee, remembering my mother telling me that storms are not the end, they are the test. And maybe remembering that silence, the one I felt all my life, the silence of doubt, of being unseen. I didn't want that silence to win. As he spoke, Sundar felt a strange release inside him, as though the weight he had carried for decades was lifting. He thought of the warnings, the threats, the voices telling him not to speak. But none of them mattered now. What mattered was the truth reaching the ears of those who needed it. The interview ended after nearly an hour. The journalist closed their notebook, their face reflecting quiet awe. Thank you, they said simply. You've given something rare today. As Sundar left the studio, he felt lighter, but he also knew the storm might still come. The following days proved him right. The interview was broadcast, and within hours, millions had watched it. Messages flooded in. Young students, struggling professionals, ordinary people who saw their own struggles mirrored in his words. They thanked him for his honesty, for showing that success was not perfection but persistence. But there were critics too. Some headlines questioned whether a CEO should reveal weakness. Some investors worried about the image of vulnerability. There were whispers in boardrooms, murmurs about whether humility could coexist with leadership. And then, another message arrived on his phone, short, sharp, and cold. You chose your path. The storm begins. Sundar read it in silence, but this time he did not feel fear. Instead, he felt a strange calm. Storms had followed him all his life. He had walked through them before, and he would walk through them again. He returned home that evening, where his children ran to greet him. His wife smiled, her eyes filled with pride. And later, when he called his mother in India, she said simply, I watched the interview. You spoke like my son, not like a CEO. That is what the world needed. Sundar sat quietly after the call, the night deep around him. He thought of the journey, of the boy in Chennai who had once spun the rotary phone in wonder, of the student in Stanford who ate cheap meals alone, of the engineer who refused to give up on Chrome. And he thought of the silence beside Modi, when his mother spoke Tamil and the Prime Minister replied in Hindi, a moment of respect that touched millions. He realized then that his story was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever doubted themselves, everyone who had ever been told they did not belong, everyone who had faced storms and wondered if they could survive. The threats might continue, the storms might grow, but the truth had been spoken, and once spoken, it could not be silenced. He looked out the window, the city lights glowing in the distance, and whispered to himself the words that had carried him through his entire life. Storms come to test, not to end. And with that, Sundar Pichai, son of Lakshmi, CEO of Google, a man shaped by storms and anchored by humility, stood ready for whatever came next.